You know that feeling when you're doom scrolling through rental listings and it honestly feels like finding an affordable place to live has turned into a full-time second job? Well, you are definitely not alone. Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack this massive, multi-layered economic puzzle of why your rent is so painfully high, and specifically how the sharing economy is playing a huge role in that. If you've been wondering why housing feels increasingly out of reach, it's really easy to just look around and say the system's broken. But the actual economic mechanics driving this trend, they're incredibly complex. Today, we're going to break down exactly why short-term rentals raise rents, looking at the macro-level housing crisis, the micro-level neighborhood impacts, and what it all means for the future of our cities. So when we ask why housing is so expensive, most people immediately point to the basics, right? The cost of lumber, nails, labor. It makes intuitive sense. Materials cost more today. Specialized labor costs more. Therefore, building a house costs more, and naturally, rent goes up. It's a very straightforward assumption. But researchers at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business dug deep into 75 years of historical economic data. And what they found? It tells a completely different, much more complicated story about where our money is actually going. Look at this data from 1950 to 2024. It reveals a really fascinating disconnect in the housing market. Relative to general inflation, the consumer price index rose about 20% over this period. Meanwhile, both construction costs and overall home prices more than doubled. But here is the critical kicker that literally changes how we need to think about this. Since 1975, house price growth has drastically outpaced building cost increases by at least 60%. Let that sink in for a second. In practical terms, this means the cost of raw bricks and mortar is no longer the primary driver of sky-high home prices. That massive premium you pay in rent isn't just covering expensive lumber. It's being driven by something else entirely. So if it's not just construction costs driving up your monthly rent, what exactly is it? All right, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The housing affordability puzzle. 2. Reallocating the housing supply. 3. The hotelization of homes. 4. Calculating the local impact. And finally, 5. Regulation and the bigger picture. Okay, Section 1. The housing affordability puzzle, beyond building costs. To truly understand why short-term rentals have such a profound and sudden impact on a city, we first got to understand the underlying condition of artificial scarcity. Check out this Urban Institute data from Connecticut. It perfectly highlights the structural barrier. An overwhelming 91% of the state's land is zoned to allow single-family housing by right. Now, by right simply means developers can build those single-family homes without jumping through endless regulatory hoops or begging local zoning boards for special permissions. But by contrast, only 2% of the land allows for the by-right construction of multifamily buildings, like apartments or condos. Strict zoning laws like these severely limit the sheer volume of new, dense housing that can be built. You're essentially capping supply in high-demand areas before a shovel even hits the dirt. This creates a highly constrained, super fragile market. It sets the perfect stage for a crisis when a new disruptor enters the scene and suddenly demands a slice of that already tiny pie. Moving right along to Section 2, reallocating the housing supply, the micro-impact. This brings us to a crucial economic concept known as supply reallocation. According to a comprehensive Wharton study, when tech platforms reduce the friction of renting to tourists, they cause landlords to completely rethink their business models. They start switching from the long-term rental market over to the short-term market. To put this into perspective, imagine a neighborhood with exactly 100 apartments. If 10 of those units get flipped into permanent tourist rentals, the physical buildings are still standing right there on the street. But the local housing pool available for people who actually live and work in that city just shrank by 10% overnight. That is a massive supply shock. The total supply of housing didn't change, but the supply actually available for local residents shrank. And look, this reallocation happens because landlords face a very stark, very rational economic choice. On one side, you have the long-term resident market. Renting to a local family offers a steady, reliable, but generally lower yield income, and it often comes with a ton of regulatory oversight and tenant protection laws. On the flip side, you have the short-term tourist market. It's high yield, incredibly flexible, and honestly, for a very long time, it operated largely under the radar without much regulation at all. From a purely economic standpoint, if a property owner wants to maximize their ROI, the incentive is heavily skewed towards chasing the lucrative weekend tourist rather than housing the steady local resident. All right, Section 3, the hotelization of homes. Commercial investors enter. Now we arrive at a really alarming concept that the Harvard Law Review coined as hotelization. It is absolutely vital to understand that this crisis isn't about a local homeowner making a few extra bucks by renting out a spare bedroom on the weekend. No, this is about well-funded commercial property owners bypassing the highly regulated traditional hotel market to quietly purchase and rent out every single unit in an apartment building on short-term rental platforms. They're effectively creating unregulated cottage hotels right in the middle of residential zones. Imagine walking out your front door to grab the morning paper, and instead of saying hi to your longtime neighbor, you bump into a continuous revolving door of weekend bachelor parties and transient vacationers. This drastically accelerates displacement because it takes crucial starter homes and affordable apartments completely out of the local market. It quite literally changes the fundamental fabric of a neighborhood. And hey, if you've ever felt like you're out there bidding against an invisible giant for a starter home, well, you probably are. Just look at this massive jump documented by researchers at the University of Arkansas. In the fourth quarter of 2020, commercial real estate investors accounted for 12.6% of all U.S. home purchases. Just 1 year later, by the end of 2021, that number shot up to a record 18.4%. Giant institutional real estate investors are increasingly outbidding young families for single-family homes. And rather than flipping them to sell to other families, they're often converting them into permanent commercial vacation rentals. The everyday home buyer, relying on a standard mortgage, simply cannot compete with that kind of institutional, all-cash buying power. Let's look at the numbers. Section 4, calculating the local impact, the hard data. The financial toll this reallocation takes on local economies is just staggering. According to a 2022 study highlighted by Inside Airbnb, prior to their recent strict regulations, New York City experienced an aggregate renter welfare loss of $2.7 billion. In simple terms, $2.7 billion effectively evaporated from the budgets of everyday New Yorkers. That's money local residents were forced to pay in artificially inflated rent, purely driven by the short-term rental squeeze, just to keep a roof over their heads. That is billions of dollars pulled directly from the pockets of the local workforce. And it's really important to recognize that this is a global phenomenon because the mathematical laws of supply and demand, well, they don't care about borders. Up in Ontario, Canada, a 2024 study estimated that renters across the province paid an additional 2.6 billion Canadian dollars that was directly tied to the impact of the short-term rental market suffocating their local housing supply. Whether you are living in Manhattan or Toronto, if units are pulled off the market for tourists, local renters pay the penalty. The mechanics of this price inflation are incredibly consistent across markets. A massive Wharton study looked at the entire United States market and confirmed a direct, undeniable mathematical relationship. For every 10% increase in short-term rental listings in a given zip code, local rents measurably increase by 0.42%, and overall house prices jump by 0.76%. But what's even more revealing here is that researchers found this pain is felt most acutely in neighborhoods with fewer owner-occupiers. Why? Because those renter-heavy neighborhoods are full of the exact affordable starter-type apartments that are easiest for investors to flip into highly profitable vacation rentals. Now, beyond the financial spreadsheets, we also see profound social costs, known in economics as negative externalities. A high density of short-term rentals leads to increased noise, traffic, and a transient population that has zero long-term investment in the local community. It drives rapid gentrification, displacing the very workers who make the city run. This intense pressure cooker is exactly what led to the unforgettable 2024 protests in Barcelona, documented by World Habitat. It's a bizarre, almost comical symptom of a broken system when you have frustrated local residents setting up ambushes with super soaker water pistols, squirting completely baffled tourists sitting at cafes while shouting, "Tourists go home." It's an absurd image, sure, but it highlights a very poignant reality where residents feel entirely pushed to the brink by unchecked tourism. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Regulation and the Bigger Picture. Tracking the evolution of this industry shows just how rapidly things escalated out of control. There's a profound, almost painful irony here. Think about it. A company that literally started in 2008 as a scrappy way to help people pay their rent by letting a stranger crash on an air mattress in their living room has accidentally evolved into a core reason why millions of people can no longer afford to pay their rent today. The platform growth exploded by 800% by 2011. By 2015, major cities like London realized they had a crisis on their hands and stepped in to enact 90-day rental limits. Fast forward to 2024, and we are seeing outright citizen revolts. It is a textbook case of software and technology moving infinitely faster than civic infrastructure and zoning laws. So how are cities fighting back? To combat commercial hotelization, software and compliance platforms like Granicus have outlined data-driven best practices to help local governments finally reclaim their housing stock. Effective regulation involves 4 distinct steps. First, draft strict primary residence requirements. This means you actually have to live in the home, which stops Wall Street from buying up the whole block. Second, cap the number of unhosted rental nights at something like 90 days, ensuring the property remains a home rather than a full-time hotel. Third, legally mandate that the tech platforms share their actual booking data so local authorities aren't flying blind. And fourth, implement continuous compliance monitoring to actually enforce the rules. When cities implement these precise steps, research proves they can successfully reduce rents and return crucial starter homes back to the local market. However, to remain completely objective and intellectually honest in this explainer, we really have to look at the whole picture. Short-term rentals act as a massive accelerant. It's like gasoline poured on a fire, but they are not the match that originally started the fire. As this quote from World Habitat perfectly reminds us, regulating short-term rentals is absolutely vital, but it's not a magic silver bullet. We must also tackle the deeper systemic root causes. We have to build more housing. We must fix those restrictive single-family zoning laws we discussed earlier. And we simply have to address decades of underinvestment in urban development. Ultimately, the data is clear. Unmitigated short-term rentals act as a very heavy burden on a housing market that was already struggling with a severe lack of supply. It forces every single community to step back and answer a really difficult, really human question. How do we balance the undeniable economic benefits of a booming tourist industry with the fundamental right of local residents to actually have affordable housing? It's a debate about who, exactly, our neighborhoods are truly being built for. Are they for the people who visit them, or the people who live in them? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this provided some clarity on the complex economics shaping our cities today.